Is in the first chunk here, I'm going to say something about this attack on overt discrimination, and then start looking at the period beginning around 1966, the late 60s and 70s. So these may be familiar signs. Be sure to look at the array of posters, which is now near the opening to this room. Ray, who's the custodian here, saw an example of one of these signs. He said he grew up in Longmont. He remembers those signs on stores when he was young. He also remembers the banners at Johnson's Corners stretched over the road saying, in effect, no dark-skinned people allowed on the streets after dark, but in somewhat cruder language apparently. Or that seems to be how it was. So that pressure for removal of overt discrimination was led by veterans, as we talked about before. And we have some wonderful interview material you could use with your students about when soldiers came back and they were in their uniforms, they walked into a bar or a pool hall, they wanted to be served on a normal basis, and the proprietor said, no, we don't serve people like you. And ultimately, in each case, the police were called. And as I mentioned yesterday, rather surprisingly, the police sided with the veterans. And I'm still puzzled about that, because we also have examples which are in the text, the sources that are available to you. We have examples of police bias and the assumptions that police were making in Longmont about Latinos. So why it was that they stuck up for the veterans, I'm not quite sure. And my guess is that it's partly that all these cases occurred when the veteran was in uniform. And so there may have been a sense of solidarity among sort of peacekeepers. They may really have felt that these soldiers had been fighting for the country, they deserved better treatment. But maybe they only meant it for veterans in the first place. We don't really know. But once the signs were down, then it was open to everybody. Yeah.
What was the history of the police supporting before that? Like, did they support the bar owner and the restaurant? Was there a problem before? Was there no?
There was no.
Like, did it switch?
There was no problem before, because during the Klan period, which is when these signs went up in the 20s, Latinos were keeping their heads down. They were not challenging them. So the first direct challenges came at the hands of these veterans, who were then kind of empowered themselves by their service, as well as morally angry that there they had been fighting and now they couldn't buy a hamburger, they couldn't play pool. Yeah?
So when you say the signs and the discrimination was like 1920 to 1945?
Or 55 even, because we hear a lot about veterans coming back from the Korean War.
For years.
But for years, yeah. And there's at least one record of such a sign in Boulder, but mainly they were here. You couldn't even, we have an account of a woman who grew up in Longmont, Latina, and she remembers that when her family took her to buy, they would buy new shoes at the start of the school year for each of the kids. And there was a shoe store on Main Street in Longmont, but they couldn't go in the front door. They had to go around the back alley. And then there was a separate little room at the back where Latinos could try on shoes. But it was distinct from where Anglos tried them on in the big area in the front. So we're talking about a pretty pervasive system of business-oriented segregation. So it was a dramatic change in terms of external overt discrimination when those signs came down. That does not, however, mean that people's attitudes changed. And as we saw yesterday, there is very clear evidence that at least among a small number of people, not just racist attitudes, but more specifically Klan behavior continued well through the 20th century and maybe into right now. So that was the important feature of the late 40s, late 50s. But beginning in the middle of the 1960s, the situation changed at a much larger, more dramatic, more activist way all through the county, and indeed all through Colorado and all through the country. So the background to these changes were, first of all, as we discussed earlier, the emergence of a Chicano identity, a sense that we should be proud of our heritage. Rather than hiding what we eat, we should take it out into the public. We should show other people about our heritage. We should teach Mexican dances and display them. We should be proud of being Chicano. And that term Chicano you'll be hearing more about today, but it had political overtones as well. Chicanos, people who defined themselves as Chicanos in this period, were activists. They wanted to see social and political change. So more conservative, older Latinos often did not adopt the name Chicano. They would continue to call themselves Hispanics primarily. Yeah.
What's the etymology of Chicano?
You'll hear about that from Jason, so I don't want to get into that. Thank you. It's a great question. And we saw also that part of this new Chicano awareness was a recognition that there were some pretty sharp gaps within the Latino community in Boulder County and elsewhere between older families who are now whose kids were in high school, maybe even going to college now in the late 60s and 70s, newer immigrants who had just come, and migrant workers whom everybody ignored. There was just no attention to migrant workers until the mid-60s and really until the 70s. So reaching out to migrant workers was part of the sort of philosophy of the Chicano movement, that we are all people from Spanish-speaking backgrounds. We all need to recognize our common concerns, our common challenges. We need to be able to work together. Then the other factor, which I mentioned before, was simply that these new kinds of employment opportunities brought in college-educated, middle-class Latinos from other parts of the country who joined the existing educated Latinos who were already here. And that formed an enlarged potential leadership group for Latino Chicano pressure.
Marjorie, real quick.
Yeah.
You mentioned Rocky Flats.
Yeah.
I've studied it extensively because I'm fascinated by it. And
Okay.
The cover-up. Do we have any interviews or any? I'm interested in discrimination within Rocky Flats.
Okay.
How everyone in Rocky Flats was kept so separate from everyone else. So how more separate were Latinos?
There is a lot of information. We should talk about this later, but
Okay.
but there's a whole big oral history project that's been done at the Carnegie Library with Rocky Flats people. So they have a ton of information, and we have information also about Latinos. But maybe if you'll excuse me, I'm going to move on now. But it's a great question, so let's talk.
Of course.
So what I want to do in the remaining time is to talk about three groups that were putting pressure within the local community. So the first is the one that I touched on briefly before, which was this group of parents and community members in Longmont who were pushing the St. Vrain Valley schools in the early 1970s. And Esther Blazon, whom you met last night, was one of the key people in this pressure group, but certainly not alone. There were a lot of them. The St. Vrain Valley School Board was, at that time, unlike any other time, extremely conservative. And extremely resistant to any suggestion of change. The kinds of concerns that Los Chicanos para la Justicia, the sort of things they were talking about were more Latino Chicano teachers and counselors, big concern with guidance counselors, more attention to Latino subjects within the school curriculum, a big concern with the number of kids who were graduating from high school as broken down by ethnicity, concern with the kind of counseling that Latino kids were getting as far as going on to college. They weren't getting any. The assumption was, of course, they would not be going on. And then also a range of sort of secondary issues that the Chicano group felt were affecting Latino children. For instance, that girls could not wear jeans to school, but they could wear pantsuits. So who can afford a pantsuit? So there were issues of those kinds as well. This group was terrific. I love them. The St. Vrain District recognized they had to do something. And so they sort of would name they would accept this group as a little advisory group to offer some suggestions. Well, then at the next school board meeting, 40 people would come in and say, wait a minute, these are not suggestions, these are demands. And here they are, here's our list. We want to see action. And the school board would say, oh, well, let's set up a commission to talk about that. And then there would be another 3 months, and then the people from the school board would come back and say, well, actually we found that these are not real issues, not really of concern. I was thinking about it actually last night with respect to this group. One of the concerns, one of the demands from the activist group was Chicano material in the curriculum. And the school board came back and said, well, if you want something like that, write it and show it to us, and then we'll consider it. And the Chicano parents said, wait a minute, we're not educators. We don't know how to write curriculum. You guys have to write the curriculum. That's your job. You and the teachers need to write it. And the school board said, oh, well, we wouldn't have time for that. So it was just a series of delays, put-offs, stalled efforts, without quite saying. The Chicano group was in a position to get a big grant. There was outside money to pay for some of these things. They put in a request for it. They filled out the application to the school board, but the money was actually coming from outside. I think they asked for something like $42,000. The school board granted them $4,500. So it was just a matter of doing little enough to keep them quiet, in effect. It was very insulting. Well, eventually,
Sorry, you're still specifically talking like 70s-ish.
I'm talking early 70s. Okay. That's right. This was sort of 71, 72, 73.
Okay.
Then eventually they hired Esther. And she then, for 3 years, as you heard last night if you were at the party, was the bilingual director, the first, and for a long time the only, because at the end of her 3 years, and she was quite aggressive, she was really in their face, and they just didn't like her. And her contract was not renewed at the end of 3 years, and they didn't hire a replacement. So it was quite a while before another bilingual director came in. Meanwhile, while she did a lot of education in the community. She was terrific. And one of the pieces that's on the website that is great, and they actually have copies of it here, is this editorial on why bilingual, bicultural, multicultural education is so important. And it is a stunning piece to read because it could have been written in last week's paper. Yeah. And all of those issues are still there, and she expressed them in very much the same terms that we would probably write if we were sending an editorial, a guest opinion today. So, yeah.
I'm curious about why this work doesn't seem to have endured.
Yes.
Like, as a parent, and in Longmont, I wanted to send my daughter to bilingual school. I assumed that there would be a bilingual school in Longmont. It doesn't exist. Like, there is no bilingual education except for, first, second grade kids.
English language learners, yeah.
Get like a little bit of native language.
It's a.
In the last 2 years. Yeah. And right, the people at Evening Peaks were telling me they're cutting that out. They're only going to have one bilingual second grade next year, and it's all really
and I mean, the whole thing is a heartbreak. The teachers who have been involved with the history project were just mourning this because things really did change. And one of the areas that's terrific, it's so exciting, is what was being done with migrant worker kids in the 70s. There were all of these special programs within the school year for kids who were coming in late, leaving early. There were neat summer programs. Is that my 3-minute warning?
I completely forgot about the 3-minute warning. We're down to about 2 minutes, but I did have something to say about your question. Can I answer it?
Yeah.
It's okay. My understanding, at least, I don't know, you might remember this from our, whatever class it was where we learned about this stuff.
They all bleed together.
Yeah, they all bleed together.
Yeah.
Is that with the Bilingual Education Act in 1968, this was promoted and it was talked about, and people were expected to make changes, and this makes sense. This is like 1975, right?
70. That was 74.
When Nickelby came in 2000, it pretty much erased and eradicated like anything. No Child Left Behind. Sorry. Okay. In 2000 with George Bush.
I've never heard Nickelby.
Oh, that's
Nicholas
what I've heard.
NCLB. Okay.
Yeah.
Never heard of Nickelby.
And so that kind of trumped any other type of policies or legislation. And so in 2000, when George Bush, proposed that, it nixed any policies that happened with the Bilingual Education Act.
Yeah, and I know like the Lau versus Nichols Act, which states that the federal government has to have some kind of bilingual education, doesn't say how.
Right.
That was the
left
problem.
up to the schools.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and local control.
Well, I just want to put it out there for anybody who works. I don't work in Tapering, I work in Boulder, but I live in Tapering. I would love. There's this charter school movement, right? We should start a dual language charter school in London. Okay.
I think a lot of them.
I talked
Yeah.
to Carly actually talked to the principal at Central. Yeah. So we'll talk. Sorry, go ahead, Margie.
Good. Well, yes. So a lot happened in the 70s, and including with migrant worker summer programs. So we've got some great material from these kids in the summers.
Deeper, but it's okay. Keep going.
Okay, thank you. And those have gone too. And so the generation of Esters who were in there fighting, and did get something done at least, they look back now and they say, but wait, everything we accomplished little by little, it's gone. We're starting over again. So this is not a very encouraging story. One of the features of the 70s, late 60s and 70s, was that the activists in that period of whatever sort, whoever you were so discouraged about the establishment, the system, the Vietnam War, all of these power systems to them seemed so strong. And as though they had tried to work within them, nothing had happened. And that therefore the only means of getting attention, of trying to get anything done, was through protest. So across the board, that was a violent period with not just sit-ins and boycotts and things, but there were a bunch of bombs being thrown around too, in Boulder and everywhere. But that it was because of the perception that the power system was so mighty that they couldn't hope to work within it, that they had to take these radical steps outside it. I think one of the things that has changed, and you were alluding to it, I think very correctly, is that at least under some circumstances now, there is the possibility to work within the system. Not always, but sometimes. So sometimes you have to go ahead and organize and have, protests and so on. But I think that that is an area of change. I think that, for instance, within the two school systems now, school districts, there are people who are sympathetic to these issues. They don't necessarily have much power themselves. But there is at least somebody there now, which there wasn't in the early 70s. So I think that what Esther was trying to say is that you, as you pointed out, you have to choose your strategy based on what the options are in front of you. And I don't think that she was saying that her actions then were wrong. I think she's saying that maybe the kind of militancy that she displayed then would not be the most effective way to get things done now. Okay, well, we need to scoot along. Sorry, Kara.
How many? 2 more minutes, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay.
MABCU. Sorry, I always get those mixed up. MABCU is an absolutely nifty organization. Their papers are now in the archives at CU Boulder. We've rescued them from somebody's basement, which is great. That organization was composed of local people who wanted to push for better treatments for Chicanos. They were remarkably activist. They complained about the police all the time. There was this incredible incident in which Jorge Gonzalez, the head of the Crusade for Justice, was speaking at a school in Longmont, in Lafayette, and an informer, remember this is the period of COINTELPRO and the FBI and all of that, so an informer in Denver who had infiltrated the Crusade for Justice warned the Lafayette police that Jorge Gonzalez was going to advocate violence. And the Lafayette police totally panicked. They called in every single police sheriff's officer from the entire district. There were police cars streaming in. They evacuated the two schools right next to each other. One where he was speaking, the next one they set up as an emergency control command post for riots. And they had all of these people there. There was a helicopter circling it. It was an incredible show of force by authorities and military force, I mean police force. And Jorge Gonzalez came and he did not, and then the auditorium was ringed with police officers, the whole auditorium around the edges. So MABCU brought a complaint then against the police for violation of civil rights, intimidation. That was the kind of thing that they complained about, and it was the kind of thing that was going on. This was a tense, scary period. People were really on edge. So MABCU did a lot of great work in this very sort of confrontational, we need to fire the police chief, we need to get rid of the sheriff, they were right out there. Well, they got a little tired, I think, and discouraged on the same grounds that Esther was talking about. They began to wonder whether confrontation really was the best way to try to get things done. So that group continued, but it didn't really do much after around 1973-74, and it was largely replaced by a local chapter of LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, which was a nationwide organization, more middle class, more conservative, not conservative, but more moderate. So the same people who had been running MABCU now were running LULAC. And LULAC was much more, you know, we'd like to work with the police, we'd like to try to get more police officers who are Latinos, we'd like to offer scholarships for students to go to the university. It was more kind of mainline. And in the end, Ubaldo Valdez, who was active in both of them, thinks that actually LULAC probably accomplished more in the end. But if MABCU hadn't been out there fighting first, it's unclear that the police would have paid any attention even to LULAC. So again, it's this question of what are the tactics? When does being really aggressive pay off? Do you have to be to get somebody's attention? And once that's happened, then can other people step in and work a little more moderately, cooperatively? Okay.
But that was the argument for every civil rights movement.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King, right?
Right.
Where do you finally just say, you know, that's the division?
Mm-hmm. And that was one of the interesting things about Chavez's work with the farm workers, was right from the beginning. He said, we are using nonviolent tactics.
Right.
We're using mass, large-scale nonviolent tactics. But we are not going to be out there throwing bombs.
I've taught all of these poems in my high school classes. Kids love them. And the found poem idea, I think, is something that you could do at any level with a topic you could give them, you know, like a big abstract word and have as a challenge kind of. And I've done it with nonfiction articles where you give kids nonfiction articles to read and they circle words and phrases and they have to do a poem based on that, and I have them just later on in the classroom. So it's just kind of one of those also, I think, go-to activities for when it's Friday and you don't know what to teach and you're like, I'm going to do a found poem, I'm going to try and make it work. So
let's move along here, because I hope to have time to play you a little music as well as the rest of what we're doing. Another area of Chicano activity, of activism and protest and pressure for change, came on the campus. So as I mentioned the other day, there was a new program set up specifically in this area, the Migrant Action Program, that took farm workers' children, brought them to campus, even though they did not fill the normal official requirements for qualification, and then provided them with scholarships, financial scholarships, advising, and so on. When they got to campus, they were part of the EOP, the Educational Opportunities Program, which was a federally supported project all over the country. The MAP program expanded then beyond initially just field workers' kids to kids from rural districts and not very large and strong high schools to all Latino kids. So they were bringing in kids then from poor neighborhoods in Denver as well. When those students got to campus, the university was totally unprepared for who they were going to be and what their concerns were. So the Latino kids who'd been on campus before were light-skinned, they came from educated families, or at least financially comfortable families, and they defined themselves as white, and they were accepted as white, and they were distinguished from the teeny number of African Americans or Asian Americans. Those other people were minorities, but we are white. Well, when these kids arrived, and as I mentioned, they came sort of overnight, over the course of one summer, several hundred of them arrived. There were 1,000 of them eventually on campus. They were from very, very different backgrounds. These were kids who had grown up, in most cases, living in poverty. They'd gone to crummy high schools often. A number of them had not, in fact, even finished high school. They had to sort of get their GED in the summer before they enrolled. So they had some academic challenges. A number of them, in fact, didn't make it, but many of them did. But more troubling to the university was their attitude, which was not, oh, we're so grateful that you've accepted us here on campus. But it was, wait a minute, let's look around this campus. For one thing, everybody's white. For another thing, the other students are racist. For another thing, where are the Latino teachers? There aren't any. Where are Latino subjects? All the same issues that the Longmont Latinos were pushing for at the high school level. The university dealt with this very badly. It didn't treat them with respect, didn't listen to their issues. It just said, you guys should be so grateful you're here and don't come to us with all that other stuff. So the students became increasingly radicalized. And the group that they formed on campus, UMAS, Union of Mexican American Students, was quite energetic in its actions. They protested on campus. They, at one time or another, took over various buildings. They occupied the buildings and wouldn't let anybody else in. They had very strong connections with other issues more widely. So they supported the lettuce workers' strike in the San Luis Valley. They supported the grape workers' strike, the boycott of grapes, in connection with the Chavez movement. They were opposed to the Vietnam War, as were many people of color, on the grounds that, on several grounds. And they were totally in the university's face. They organized big marches down Broadway onto campus. They boycotted stores that were selling lettuce or that were selling any kind of grape products. They boycotted the liquor stores because they didn't like Coors Brewery, with very good reason. And they became increasingly frustrated by how unresponsive the university was, by how unresponsive the forces of authority in the town were. There's wonderful interview clips of Cleo Estrada, who was a long-term counselor at CU Boulder, talking about running across campus, being chased by the police with the tear gas everywhere after one of these big protests. So things were really pretty violent, and you're going to be hearing more about that later from Kat and Jason. So their activities, in a sense, form the background, although in not entirely clear ways, to the bombings in 1974. There were, as I mentioned before, 6 young people killed in their 20s, some current students at UMAS, including a woman named Neva Romero, who had just been elected as part of the Student Government Coalition. She was the first Latina to be in that position. And then the others were former students at CU, one a lawyer, a graduate of the law school, who was based in the San Luis Valley, but all former people or connected to UMAS. Whether the bombs, how those bombs got in the car is not known. As I mentioned, the police said that the kids were making bombs and they blew up on them. Possible, but everybody who knows those kids said they just wouldn't have been doing that. It is conceivable because there had been 3 bombs had gone off in the previous few months in Boulder, always in unoccupied buildings at night, symbolic buildings. County courthouse, one of the elementary schools that they'd been picketing. Possible. Equally possible, I have this sort of left-wing suspicious nature. There was also COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program run by the FBI, which was deliberately infiltrating radical groups and in some cases promoting violence within those groups in order to discredit them. We know, for instance, that COINTELPRO had gotten into the Crusade for Justice, Corky Gonzalez's movement. We know that they were active in the American Indian movement. Remember? Sorry? That's right. All of those activities then that were the Black Panthers, all of these radical groups, we now know in retrospect, we know or we suspect that the FBI had agents in them who pretended to be normal members, but who in many cases then encouraged the use of violence, promoted it, and in the case of the American Indian movement actually seemed to have provided weapons and supplies for violence. Because then when the groups were violent, then the FBI could totally crack down on them and say, look, see, they're terrorists, we need to get rid of them. So it's possible that COINTELPRO had something to do with these bombs. Unclear, still is a subject of uncertainty and trouble, disquiet among Latinos, because it was never clear what went on, and it still isn't really. Now, one of the the nice little side effects of this for us was that one of the students who was involved in UMAS was a guy named Augie Cordova, who is now in his late 60s. He was the boyfriend of Neva Romero, who was one of the people killed in the bombings. And he was a musician. So he played guitar, he wrote songs, and he was part of one of the sets of activities which the UMAS kids did, which fits in with what we were hearing about this morning, which was street theater, teatro. So the UMAS kids did a great deal of street theater all around the southwestern part of the country. They went out and they performed, they did theater, they did music, they wrote a lot of music to go with it. So these UMAS kids at CU Boulder were among the leading promoters of this Chicano student movement in the whole region. So Augie wrote a song called Yo Soy Chicano, which became one of the sort of anthems of the student movement. And after the bombings, he wrote another song about Los East de Boulder, which is in the tradition of a corrido, which is a Latin American, it goes way back in Mexico, but it's a protest song used to promote social change of some kind. So if all goes well, here, so I should then explain. So there's no recording from the period of those songs. We have about a 10-second clip from an old beginning of one of them, and that's all. So Augie was persuaded to set up his recording studio in his basement, which he hadn't used for 30 years, and he then re-recorded both of those songs for the History Project. And so we have then the Spanish and the lyrics, the English lyrics, both on the website, and the song itself. So let's see if this works.
Voy a cantar un corrido que en Colorado pasó. Murieron los 6 de Boulder 2 noches en mayo en 74. Era una noche ocupada cuando de pronto llegó ese bombazo hieloso, como a las 8, 3 vidas llevó. Amaneció la mañana, ahí en la sierra yo vi la alma de Neva Romero, subiendo hacia el cielo, sonriendo hasta el fin. En este cielo de sierra de Colorado se ven las almas de 6 soldados, 6 fusilados, 6 hijos del bien.
Let me just remind you about the shootings. When we went last year, Maria was much stronger about the immediate connection between the shootings and that mural, the mosaics. Yesterday he toned it down, so it's interesting. There are very good newspaper accounts of it. You can trace it day by day by day, right straight through, and they're all available on the website. And this is something I wanted to be sure to show to you, which is that as a result of the tension between the Latino community and the police and the city of Longmont, the Latino community asked for the intervention of the Department of Justice because the police and the city council were not paying attention to the requests or demands that the Latinos were putting forward. So the Department of Justice intervened. They sent somebody to Longmont who was there with them for 6 weeks, serving as a mediator. And at the end, he then almost forced the city of Longmont to agree to this memorandum of understanding. And in it, it committed the city to a whole series of measures which were exactly the ones that the Latinos had been demanding. That is, a ride-along possibility where people would ride with police officers, a hotline for reporting trouble, use of lie detectors for the police if it was suspected that they were not telling the truth. A lot of very progressive clamp down on police freedom of action kinds of measures. And those were then accepted by the city of Longmont, which still kind of surprises me. But the Latinos were resisting violence, but they were extremely upset. And I think the city felt that with the persuasion of the Department of Justice. So I wanted you to see that because it's interesting that the Latino community asked for this help, that the Department of Justice was willing to provide it, and that in the end the city agreed to this. Yeah?
You just said that, but it wasn't the city that asked for the Department of Justice to
No,
come in,
it was the Latinos who asked for the department to come in.
I'm just curious, was that the Reagan Justice Department or the Carter Justice Department? Like what side of 1980? When did that happen?
It happened in the summer.
So whose administration would that have been? Do you know?
No, it wouldn't have been Reagan.
It would have been still Carter. Well, I'm just curious.
Yeah, were they?
If Reagan, because Ed Meese and I just don't think of him as a big progressive.
No, but I think locally, because I mean, and the result of this was the founding of El Comité. So again, last year there'd been a lot of trouble, again with the police in Longmont, and El Comité called for the Department of Justice to come back in, and they did, and they then mediated quite vigorously last year in Longmont. So the DOJ is willing to do that.
Right. I mean, it just changes with each administration.
Well, it does at the top, but I think in terms of, I mean, the people who were doing this were the regional Department of Justice centered for the southwest region of the country. I'm not sure how much politics, I'm sure it affects it some, but it may take time for the changes to trickle down to the lower levels. So, yeah.
I'm sure I can find this out on my own, but do you know what happened at the end of the trial, like for the police officers?
He was acquitted. Acquitted?
He was acquitted.
Yep. And I mean, it was, these two young people were not armed. They had no weapons. And the guy who did it was, he'd been there for 5 weeks and he'd been very badly trained. He had this huge weapon. The police training course up to that time was minimal. He'd had no training in how to deal with this kind of direct confrontation. So, shooting somebody in the back running across the street, you wouldn't think you'd need a lot of training for that. But
how to handle his fear and the reaction.
His anger. So I was saying to a couple people that I thought that was really interesting, that it was the white kid that started the confrontation.
Yep. He yelled out of the car window, a familiar set of expletives for the police, and they went after him. They called him out. They got him on the ground, and then the Latino kid said, "Wait a minute, he's our friend. We're going to support him." So it was a very complicated, unfortunate situation for everybody.